Okay, so 12:31. I don't have a bell to ring today. I am on KRCN is on assignment actually in Seattle, Washington. I am visiting grandkids and family here and coming to you from the Thompson Hotel lobby as a squatter. I'm not staying at the Thompson Hotel. I'm just borrowing some space. And it'd be a little bit different today, different meeting, but want to welcome everybody to the penultimate meeting of Rotary Club of Novato, live from the Thompson Hotel in Seattle, Washington. So welcome.
There we go. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Rotary, as I was saying, has given birth to some phenomenal projects in its history. And right up there with Polio and RotaPlast is ShelterBox. It was started over 25 years ago as a small Rotary project in the UK, in Cornwall, and has grown to become one of the world's leading global first responders, providing emergency shelter and supplies to thousands of families worldwide following natural and man-made disasters and civil unrest. Footage of their on-the-ground work is often seen on CNN and other news outlets. They were a Nobel Prize nominee in 2018 and 19 for their conflict resolution efforts in some of the most dangerous parts of the world. It continues as an official project partner of Rotary International and is a recipient of the Global Humanitarian Service Award. Our club has supported ShelterBox for the last 5 years, and I know some of you give personally. We are very fortunate to have with us again our speaker, Jim Carriere. He gives an excellent talk and has given it a couple of times to the club over the years, but it's been a while and there's lots of new information. Jim is a San Rafael Harbor Rotarian, has been involved with ShelterBox for more than a decade as a volunteer and leading fundraiser. ShelterBox has a number of affiliate organizations, and Jim served on the ShelterBox USA Board of Directors from 2010 to 2018, including board chair in 2017 and 18. Professionally, Jim is a senior vice president with First Federal Savings of San Rafael. He and his wife, Nancy, have lived in Oakland since 1985, and their son, Joseph, is a recent graduate of Willamette in Salem, Oregon, and studying veterinary medicine at UC Davis. Jim will tell us about ShelterBox's inspiring work as a global first responder and what that looks like during a pandemic. Jim, it's great to have you back again.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to quickly share my screen. And I trust everyone can see that. Someone give me a thumbs up. You never want to assume on Zoom, but okay. We're going to get started. I thank you for that wonderful introduction. That frankly makes me sound like I do a lot more than I actually do. I appreciate you guys putting up with my crude version of a green screen behind me here. A couple weeks ago, I moved my office downstairs. My mom was visiting, and so she doesn't have to walk up the stairs as many times. We put her in my office. But after moving my office, which I've been working remotely now for 15 months, which is 4 laptops and 6 screens downstairs, I'm too lazy to move it back up. But behind me, we have 31 years of marriage and 20 years in the same house worth of crap. And I really didn't want you to see that for the next 30 minutes. So, you know, we've got my quickly put together version of a green screen. So we're going to talk about ShelterBox. Yes, I have presented to the club twice before, most recently when Marty Wickenheimer was president. I really, when I accepted the speaking gig today, I kind of in the back of my mind hoped we'd all be together again. So maybe someday in the future, you'll give me a chance to come talk to you guys in person, but we're going to do it via Zoom. Zoom's actually been a great thing for ShelterBox because it literally allows me to sit in Oakland, California and do a presentation in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I've gotten a chance to speak to Rotary clubs. Bill Tobin, who works for ShelterBox USA up in El Dorado Hills, has done, I think at last count, 174 Zoom meetings across the United States going ShelterBox. So as described, ShelterBox started in Helston, Cornwall, England. And the reason we exist, quite frankly, is because of the massive number of people that are displaced. As of today, it's approximately 110 million people. It's a big number. When I started doing Zoom presentations, that was more like 800,000, to give you an idea how much it's grown. And the scary thing is that 25 people are forced from their homes every minute for various reasons. So that means by the time I land this plane in 30 minutes or so, another 750,000 people will have lost their home, whether that's conflict, whether that's disaster. And understand that these events in many cases are no longer interdependent. A lot of what we see in conflict is caused by change in climate and things like that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through the first slides because, again, I think most people are familiar with ShelterBox. But yes, we are the leader now in tented shelter worldwide. Our iconic green box, a typical relief tent, which if you've been to a Rotary convention, you've seen this. We have this up at Pets. And shelter kits, which is something we do a lot of today. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Of the tents themselves, we actually have 4 tents that we use out there. The standard relief that you've seen, the OASE we use in certain situations. Often we'll see with the standard relief tent, people will drape blankets over the edge to fill out that front canopy. So we designed another tent that's incredibly stable. It's not quite as big. The Flex 3 looks like it's about the same size of the others. It's not. It's much larger. This tent is a beast. I hang insulated material from the inside for cold weather climates. You'll notice I've actually got a wood-burning stove inside the tent for warmth, and then it vents out. And then a UN spec tent. We use these often in areas where it would be very dangerous for the recipients if it was obvious the aid came from the West, for instance, in Syria. A lot of our deployments in Africa, where you have conflict. So we want a tent out there. Normally we want our logo and the Rotary logo on everything we do, but in these situations, it's a very generic tent. The basic kit that we've had for years and years and years, we constantly are looking for ways to upgrade this. One thing that's always been in there though is that children's activity pack you'll see at the bottom. And this is really one of the first things that drew me to ShelterBox is when I saw stuff like this, because we understand that if the parents can't keep their kids busy, they can't focus on recovery. So everything we do, we've got things for children to keep their minds, you got to understand that child lost their home as well. So just some of the many things we put out there. Luminaids, fantastic product. If you've ever watched the show Shark Tank, the people that founded Luminaid actually got their funding from Mark Cuban on Shark Tank. They produce solar lights. This has been in all of our kits. They're great partners of ShelterBox. These provide a huge amount of security for people because you charge it, it will last for 12 to 14 hours. In fact, in the public safety power shutdowns, not this past year, but the previous year, I read by these in Oakland when we lost power for 3 nights. So that's how I went to sleep each night, was reading a book by Illuminate. These shelter kits, we do these in urban environments where sometimes tented shelter is not the best option. And we put basic tools, tarpaulins, and then we source wood locally. And what happens is we use these things, people are very resourceful, and we use these things to put together structures. And that may not look like much, but again, in the United States, we're not terribly creative, but in some of the places we deploy, it's amazing. You take that structure right there and it becomes a home, okay? And what you're looking at is about $100 to $120 worth of gear that just became a home for somebody. And that is very structurally sound. So that gives you an idea of what we do with our shelter kits. We deliver our aid by any means necessary. This is a picture packing aid on mules up into the mountains of Pakistan. And I do mean by whatever means necessary. These boxes go out anywhere from 100 to 120 pounds, and that's carrying them up this step. There were over 400 boxes that were carried up that little ladder structure right there in Nepal. So by whatever means necessary, and that's no bull. Now that's actually a terribly bad joke. That is actually a water buffalo in the Philippines, and we're using that to drag up the hill. But again, more often we will use contacts on the ground, often Rotarians, to source trucks and whatnot to get this gear where it needs to go. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you could just land a 747 or a cargo plane right next to a disaster zone. Well, it doesn't happen that way. You know, you've got to get the stuff in there, and then you've got to get it to where it needs to go. And then still my favorite picture in ShelterBox, the box has its uses too. This family was in Africa, living in one of our tents. This was way back when we had the green tents, but they took the blanket, put it inside the box itself, and that became the crib for this child. So just an idea. Now, normally what people will do is they'll use that box for storage, whether it's water storage or whatnot, dry storage, but just an idea of how resourceful people can be with our gear and our aid. I think the key that separates ShelterBox from most organizations is how we do it. Our response teams, highly trained volunteers that deliver our aid. Now, we've not been able to do that as much in COVID, but the fact that we make the determination as to who gets the aid, where it's going to go, how much is needed. You know, we always pack disaster specific. So those first boxes may go in, but if additional aid is needed, we will say, we want you to take these 5 items out of a box and put these in, because that's what we need right now today. There are times when we will just fill these boxes with nothing but water filtration systems, because that's what's needed. These two gentlemen are close friends of mine. On the left is David Ebbe from Tennessee. On the right is Wayne Robinson from Georgia. David, before he retired from the SRT ranks, he had young children that were starting to grow up. So he quit deployed 22 times for ShelterBox over a 5-year period, to give you an idea how dedicated he was. Something that's very important to what we do now is we learn from each deployment. Very, very important. We call these our meal teams for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. And after every deployment, we'll send a team in afterwards. What worked? What didn't work? What could work better? You know, are just basic questions. Accountability is huge. We realize that we're taking Rotarian dollars, we're taking other donor dollars out into the field, often case millions of dollars worth of aid. And we have to make sure we use it the right way. A good friend of mine from Sequim, Washington, and this is in Guatemala. He was on a meal team. This is his second deployment. Again, he's questioning people on how they work. What you're looking at started out as a shelter kit, and then they found corrugated tin for the roof and built that into their home, their shelter. And our partnership with Rotary, which was mentioned earlier. We always were a Rotary Club project, and we didn't always have the best relationship with Rotary. When we first got started, Rotary didn't quite know what to do with us. And we, you know, we went to Rotary and said, do you want to make this a project? And, you know, they asked questions like, well, can the box be blue instead of green? We said, no. We call it RotaBox. We said, no. So we kind of did our own thing for a while. And then by the time Rotary came back to us, we had, at that time, 7 internationally affiliates. And so it didn't seem like it could become a Rotary project. But fortunately, when Kalyan Banerjee was Rotary International President, and this is just after John Hugo came on as General Secretary, they actually formed a project partnership for ShelterBox. And every 2 years that has been renewed. We have a Rotary trustee that sits in a fashion on the ShelterBox trustee board. So very, very close, tight relationship. And we are Rotary's preferred provider in a disaster. I want to quickly touch on some of the largest deployments we've made, even though some of them were a long time ago, because I think each one is very key in what's formed the DNA of ShelterBox. The Boxing Day tsunami, up until this point, we had done multiple deployments, 100 boxes here, 150 boxes there. And then suddenly this massive tsunami hits in Indonesia. The epicenter was Banda Aceh, Indonesia. And we ended up putting 10,000 boxes on the ground there. And that's really where our response teams came from, because we realized how we had to sort of rebrand ourselves and work in more of a military style model. And that's what we do now. And that's, again, that's where our response teams actually came from. Give you an idea of the scope of this. This is actually a cargo, a transport plane, and there's 647 boxes on that plane itself. And again, we eventually put 10,000 boxes into that disaster. Haiti is something that we've referred to as the Super Bowl of disasters, because even though it wasn't that strong of an earthquake, the building codes in Haiti aren't quite the same as they are in the United States. And it was absolute devastation in Port-au-Prince. About 1/3 of the city was completely devastated. When we flew in there, imagine flying into SFO and looking off to your left and Foster City is gone, all right? Or flying into Oakland and Hayward is completely gone. That's what we saw when we flew in. And not only did you have the buildings down, infrastructure was destroyed, plumbing, electricity. You couldn't just clear the streets because they were still pulling some people alive from the rubble. But you had massive problems with airborne and waterborne illness. So normally where we like to help someone rebuild where they lost their home, this was the case where we had to get people up and out of the city center. And so we actually moved and started setting up tents on soccer pitches, soccer fields outside, and found out that you could get over 400 tents on a typical soccer field. And that's how we did there. To date, our largest deployment ever, 27,000 boxes and an additional 8,000 tents. Almost one half of all people in Haiti that were housed after that earthquake were housed in ShelterBox tents. And yet at that time, and still to some extent today, not that many people know who ShelterBox is. We're not a PR machine, we're a disaster relief machine. And again, an arm of Rotary. The tsunami that struck Japan, and it really was a tsunami, that was over an 8 earthquake. And an 8 earthquake in the Bay Area would completely level everything here. But Japan is built to withstand that. The Loma Prieta quake, I'm from Louisiana, scared the crap out of me. And yet that was a pretty small earthquake. The 1906 quake shook for about 40 seconds. This quake shook for over 3 minutes and yet did very little damage. It was all the tsunami that came in afterwards. It was upwards of a 30-foot wall of water. And working with Japanese authorities, we responded to this, learned a lot of neat things. And this is where we put in place for the first time what we called a shelter in shelter. So in some cases, we put our tents into the evacuation centers the Japanese had already set up, so that it allowed an area for privacy or for people to go if they were sick. Because oftentimes in Japan, if someone is ill, they would not go to an evacuation center because of respect for their fellow citizens. So we were able to use our tents in a little bit different way there. Typhoon Haiyan, at the time, it was the most powerful storm ever recorded, did a massive amount of damage. And we actually put most of our aid into an area called the Bantanyan Islands. For those of you who might know Matone Griffith, who is chief of staff from last year, her grandmother lived on the Bantanyan Islands, and they visited after the storm. She knew nothing about ShelterBox at the time. And she remembers as they were riding these dugout canoes into the beach, that's the only way to get in there, you know, she saw these white tents on the beach. She didn't know what they were. And she got there and she saw the Rotary logo and she was blown away. And she was actually able to turn to her husband, Phil, and say, you know, all that time I spend with Rotary? Well, this is why I do it. And she literally came back excited and has become a ShelterBox ambassador. She does presentations, just an idea of how ShelterBox then touched the local Rotarians' life. But the other thing that was key here is we received a lot of donations. And generally when we take disaster-specific donations, it's always with the caveat that if we can't spend it on this disaster, it will be used on the next. But we knew a lot of people wanted to help in the Philippines. So we started building transitional shelter. This is one time we did this. And to some extent, we've started doing it a little bit more. We don't want to get into mission creep. I mean, we are tented shelter. But working with ACTED, Catholic Relief, you know, Islamic Relief, and Handicap International, we were able to build these transitional shelters. And when you think about it, ShelterBox goes in first. We're the point of the sword. But if we can then put some transitional shelter in place, so you get them through the first 6 months, now something that'll last them for the next 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And then Rotary does the long-term rebuilding project. It's just another example of 2 organizations and how closely they can work together to help in these scenarios. People always ask if we deploy in the United States, and it's not often, but we do. This is the George R. Brown Convention Center after Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. You know, they figured this place could help 7,000 people. They ended up putting over 15,000 people in there. Lights are on 24/7. You know, not that we're going to be able to help these people with tented shelter, but this is another scenario where we went with our shelter in a shelter solution. So we took some old tents called middies that we couldn't even use in the field anymore, and we set them up inside the George R. Brown Center. We sent them up in different rooms. And so these could be used when people were being checked in. They could be used for medical evaluations to give them some privacy. Lactating mothers could use these to nurse and feed their babies. AA meetings were held in our tents. Church services were held in our tents. We've actually been written up in Psychology Today magazine for what something like this can do to someone who's in a horrific situation, such as a mass evac shelter, but then you give them a place where they can have 15 minutes of peace and privacy every day. Very important stuff. Lake Chad Basin. This is one of our ongoing deployments. Huge deployment. We've been working in Lake Chad for over 6 years. And this is a perfect example of conflict and climate change and global warming to some extent. What you've really got, to give you an idea where we're talking here, you've got this area in Africa where Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and Nigeria are four countries that all share Lake Chad. It's a common border for all of them, and they all depend upon Lake Chad for water. And if you look at this, you'll see that Nigeria and Cameroon have some pretty lush foliage. They're forested countries, but northern Chad and Niger are very, very arid. And so water is at a premium. The problem is that Lake Chad over the last 15 years has shrunk by about 75%. There is not enough water. So you've got drought and an area of conflict, because this is areas where Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab operate. So you've got conflict along with a disaster, a natural disaster, causing hundreds of thousands of people to be forced from their homes. A perfect example here where we would use a UN spec tent, because again, having aid there that's obviously, it's from the West, would not be beneficial to the recipient. So we use the UN spec tents here. Syria, you know, it's amazing how few people really realize how long this has gone on and how much it's affected the people of Syria and who it's really affecting. Now, you know, I certainly am not a fan of the Syrian government, but I will tell you this, that before this started, over 90% of the kids in Syria received a formal education, you know, very equivalent to our high school and even college. So it was a very well-educated, well-educated country. And again, I'm not a fan of the government there, but the fact is now that over 50% of the refugees in Syria are kids, and 50% of those kids have not been in school for over 10 years. So you may not think this affects the United States of America, but you're essentially talking about a lost generation from an educational standpoint. That absolutely affects us. And that's going to affect us for the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So hopefully we will eventually come to resolution here. And we're not just talking about the refugees, or excuse me, the IDPs in Syria. You're talking about refugees that have pushed out of Syria. It's a pretty horrific situation there. One of the things we're doing, this shows you those kids packs, trying to bring some educational materials into the kids there. And we are making a difference. You know, we're not giving them the school that they need, but trying to make a difference there. And so that's just an idea of how ShelterBox has evolved over the years. And then suddenly we find ourselves starting in March of 2020 in a global pandemic. And John Yuko, again, wonderful man, got to meet him a couple times, you know, talked about how important ShelterBox was when it comes to fighting COVID and helping in these different areas of the world. This was our very first deployment after COVID hit in Vanuatu, which is a tiny, tiny little nation. Probably the closest nation is New Zealand, but it's a good 1,000 miles from there. But they had very few cases of COVID, so they absolutely had a need for shelter, but they would not let anyone in. So literally, we sent aided, we'd never done this before, and we did training similar to this talk we're having right now. We trained people how to set up our tents and use our gear and use shelter kits on Zoom. And we did that quite a bit last year. On average, ShelterBox in a typical year would respond to 20 to 24 disasters. We actually only deployed 7 times last year because, again, travel restrictions. And even when there were areas where we could get our teams in, there were no assurances we'd be able to get them back to the United States, the UK, Germany, wherever those response team members came from. So like every other organization during COVID, we had to shift how we do things. But again, it's become a lesson in efficiency for us. Here's another perfect example where you had people in refugee camps and then the cyclone MPAM came through. And the issue here was density. And to give you an idea of what some of these refugee camps are like, I think everybody here is pretty familiar with the town of Novato, the city of Novato. The population density of Novato is approximately 1,850 people for each square mile, okay? And that feels fairly comfortable. If you're familiar with the Chinese government, if they want to shut something down, they're very good at that. And yet when COVID first struck in Wuhan, China, even though they did shut everything down, because of the population density there of approximately 3,200 people per square mile, they were unable to stop the spread. And then eventually, of course, COVID-19 spread globally. In these camps, you have 10 to 15,000 people per square mile. So you can imagine how difficult it can be to keep people safe in the middle of a pandemic. Or like I say, it's tough to shelter in place when you don't have shelter or a place, and it's really difficult to social distance in a conflict zone. So to give you an idea of some of the conditions we're working in. And when I talk about these refugee camps, that's Syria, that's Jordan, that's Lebanon, that's here in India, and in Bangladesh. And so again, we suddenly find ourselves doing deployments in the middle of COVID-19. Masks were required. You know, sometimes you have different vaccination records out there. That's not actually a vaccination record, but it was a card that enabled this gentleman to get a ShelterBox tent. And all the gear we send out now, we have hand washing stations, soap, basins, things like that. Very important, again, to help people in the middle of the pandemic help to fight this disease. And I'm going to talk about how important that is in just a little bit. Again, hand washing stations and literally setting up social distancing as we're distributing aid. Just some of the different things that we had to work with in 2020 and in 2021. And this is going to go on for quite some time, because while the United States has now had vaccinations available for quite some time, and most of the European Union has, some Southeastern Asian countries, you know, the vast majority of the globe, you know, you have countries that have had no vaccines, 1%, even 2%. Even a developed nation like Australia has only vaccinated 2 to 3% of the recipients there. So if COVID starts to spread, the big concern is that that's how these variants come up when you have unvaccinated populations. So it's very key to keep COVID from spreading in these types of environments when you have a large density of people. Something that ShelterBox has been addressing for quite some time, but is really focusing now, is climate change. I don't want to get into the political side of it, because some people may feel differently on why the climate is changing, but I think we can all agree that the climate is changing. I'm from Louisiana. Hurricanes have increased in strength massively in the last 10 years. Drought has increased across the globe. You know, California, we are probably going to have a record year for drought. Let's hope we don't have a record year for wildfires here. A lot of this is driving it. One thing that was interesting is the G7, when they met last week, they were actually meeting in Cornwall, which is where our headquarters is. They were in a little tiny island town just off of St. Ives, about 30 miles from Truro, which is where our headquarters is. And with that, I'll also say, if you ever find yourself in England, go to Cornwall. It is beautiful. And stop in Truro, great town. You can go to the ShelterBox Visitor Center and see where it actually all happens. That's where our operation teams are housed. That's where we make all of our decisions and stuff like that. You know, again, you can look at just some of the facts and the figures, but, you know, over 80% of disasters are caused by, to some extent, if you're not talking about an earthquake, we almost don't call them natural disasters anymore, because that wildfire was probably caused by drought, or that flooding was caused by a massive storm that came through. That, I mean, we've had typhoons, we've had hurricanes, we've had cyclones for you know, since the dawn of time, but never have we seen the ferocity and the number of these storms. The Philippines especially, we have actually opened up a complete office in the Philippines. We go to the Philippines 3 or 4 times a year, whether it's because of flooding, windstorms, or the number of earthquakes they have there. You know, so we've actually set up and keep gear in the Philippines year round. You can see that the warmest years on record have been the last 5, with last year, 2020, actually tying 2016. And just like anything else, it's folks in low-income countries and folks on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale that are mostly affected. You know, water scarcity is a huge issue here. And this happens in the United States as well. This is not just an international problem. We did a great presentation at my Rotary Club about a month and a half ago. A person talked about the water scarcity of the Navajo Nation. Interesting stuff. So this is not just an international issue, but it's some of the things that we're facing now. And of course, this is fueling an even greater need for emergency shelter. You know, in a perfect world, an organization like ShelterBox would not exist, but we're not in a perfect world. And we are needed more so now than ever. One of the things we're trying to do to address all of this is, again, we've always pre-positioned stock, but we're doing it even more so, because that cuts down on our carbon footprint. We don't have to ship as much. We try to locally source products, again, less shipping, and use locally sourced products. We've reduced the plastic in the kits ourselves. That box itself, it's very, very strong, but that all comes from recycled plastic. Now, you do run into some problems. For instance, in Syrian refugee camps, they actually ask us to send plastics because once the item is used, they burn it for warmth. Well, that then in itself is causing an issue, but that's trying to balance their actual needs with you know, the needs of the globe and the world. So, you know, again, much of today's conflict is caused by climate change, and it's just a matter we're trying to address. And the big key here is, again, you know, while we have turned the corner in the United States, I mean, we all know the 15th is when California reopened. And after going back and forth, Cal OSHA finally lifted mask restrictions in the workplace. So today, after my business continuity committee met, you know, we were able to tell our vaccinated employees, take your masks off. So we think that COVID's over. Well, it's not. Because if COVID exists anywhere in the globe, it can easily come back because of these variants. You know, right now we have a very scary variant out there called the Delta variant. And I do business continuity for the bank. So I'm a bit of a COVID walk at this point from all of the articles I've read and things I've kept up with. And, you know, these, so far, the different variants and mutations we've seen of COVID have, you know, the vaccines we have responded well to them. And our current vaccine structure, both the Johnson & Johnson and the 2-shot Pfizer, 2-shot Moderna, is very effective against the Delta variant. But what's a little scary here is we're starting to see in California people who get their first shot, their Pfizer or Moderna, and don't return to get their second. And while that gives you a decent protection against regular COVID, for lack of a better term, the efficacy of those vaccines drops to about 30% with this Delta variant. And so until we stamp out COVID worldwide, these different mutations and variants will arise. And eventually, you know, one's going to come up that our current vaccines are not effective against. So we're going to have to be revaccinated or get booster shots or things like that. So while we have certainly turned a corner in the United States and in the European Union and in almost all developed nations, trust me, COVID's not over until it's stamped out worldwide. That is a key, that's a medical fact. So just other things we're trying to address. And that's why we put such a focus on that last year with ShelterBox. So how can the Rotary Club of Novato help? You know, as mentioned earlier, 5 straight years you supported ShelterBox. There's also been support for ShelterBox over the years. At times, for instance, I specifically remember after the big event, Haiti, excuse me. Our district 5150 actually raised over $77,000 for ShelterBox. And what was nice there is we were able to actually designate funds for that disaster because we knew we were going to be there for a long, long time. But it doesn't really work that way. So we have this thing called the Silk or shelter. And of course, you look at the 4, 5, and 6, we pack it, we deliver it, and the communities start to recover. But none of that happens if number 1 doesn't happen, and that's the donation. So many people after disaster strikes, Rotarians are such generous people. Disaster strikes, I want to pull out the checkbook, I want to help. But you have to understand, I don't deploy today unless someone donates to me 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months earlier. So that silver of shelter is very important. That donation really needs to come before the disaster strikes, or the efficiency slows down quite a bit here. Again, because of your ongoing support of ShelterBox, Rotary Club of Novato is actually considered a ShelterBox hero. That means you have another banner that you probably won't hang up. But if I can ever start traveling again and you guys start meeting in person, I will bring you your ShelterBox hero banner. But the key is to consider making ShelterBox just a line item in your budget. That's very, very important. It's how we're successful in what we do. Okay? We always need volunteers. Everyone walks a different path in Rotary. And, I got involved with ShelterBox at the Salt Lake City convention. And it was my first Rotary convention. I was an incoming club president. And even though I'm a huge type A personality, I was completely overwhelmed by what I saw there. 18,000, 20,000 Rotarians from all the different nations. And I was actually I was, kind of freaking out a little bit. And I saw a big green tent, and my son at the time was in Scouts. So I thought it had to do with ShelterBox and scouting. So I went running over, and had nothing to do with Scouts. It was ShelterBox. And I was simply blown away by the project. And that was in 2007. And I became a volunteer at that time. And like I said, I've been honored to serve on the ShelterBox USA board. And now that my board service, I'm timed out from doing that. I'm back to just doing presentations. But, you know, if nothing else happens today, I would love for someone on your club to sign up, and I'll send you information afterwards, either through Phil or whoever, to become what we call a club champion. No real huge commitment. We just ask that we're going to send you emails once a month, let you know what's going on in the ShelterBox world. And then during your regular club meeting, whether that's happy dollars, bitch bucks, whatever you guys call it, if that individual could just give the club an update on what's going on with ShelterBox. If you want to be an ambassador and do what I do, we'll give you a nice tricked out ShelterBox shirt, you know. When I normally am at a presentation, I've got all the gear out and I show people. Everyone says, well, how do I get that? I want that in my earthquake kit. Well, you can't buy a ShelterBox. And while if you did the research, about 75% of what's in there you could buy online, if you're an active ambassador and you're out doing presentations, I'll put one of these in your garage. You will have the ultimate disaster, the ultimate earthquake kit. I've actually got 3 of them in my garage. So I'm looking for someone to become an ambassador so I can bring you a ShelterBox, because my wife wants some of this stuff out of here. If I took down this green sheet behind me, you might see some ShelterBox gear. So always looking for ShelterBox volunteers. And then just in closing, before we get to questions, I want to share a couple things you don't want to do in a disaster. It always cracks me up when I'm watching CNN or whatnot, and they're broadcasting from a hurricane, and some idiot reporter has a microphone and he's bouncing out in the wind, showing how strong the wind is. Don't do that. This is a deck board in Florida from Hurricane Maria, ripped up, poked right through a palm tree. I promise you, a coconut traveling at 120 miles an hour will kill you. The other picture might look like it's a refugee center, but it is not. That is the Marin Civic Center 6 years ago after we had the massive wildfires, and everybody rushed down to donate clothes, and everybody rushed down because they wanted to give. And while the intent was good, you can't do much with this stuff. Unfortunately, in a disaster, I hate to say it, cash is king. So things to think about when you're trying to help after a disaster. So with that, it's a little difficult on Zoom for me to see everyone. If you want to put your hand up, but I'm going to cancel the screen share. We can try that, or possibly we can use the chat feature, and I will take questions for as long as you're willing to stay on the line with me. It's Friday afternoon. I don't have a lot of intent of going back to work, even though I have a few things to do. So I'll stick around as long as you will.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Jim. That was terrific. Thanks again for coming and sharing what the ShelterBox is doing in this crazy time, and kind of so proud that we continue to make it a line item in our budget. Are there questions? I'll looking through the gallery here.
I had a question.
Yeah, Penny.
Well, I know when you went to Guatemala, everybody had to pay their own way. And I'm wondering, for your volunteers that are delivering everything, how are they, do they have to pay for their own transportation to deliver the boxes to wherever you go?
No, they don't. It's actually a great question. I don't talk a lot about the response teams anymore, but I'll give you a very quick overview. It is a very intense process to become a response team member. I've been through the training myself. It's about a 1-year process. You're going to do phone interviews and in-person interviews. We're going to run you through what we call a 4-day, which really is we're trying to, see the cream rise to the top. But more than anything, get people to eliminate. We're going to push you mentally and physically as far as we can. We're going to look for your breaking point, and if we find it, you're out of the program. That sounds harsh, but it has to be that way, because when you do deploy somewhere, it's not like you can open up a manual and say, oh, earthquake, Guatemala, or, you have to make decisions. You've got literally $1 million worth of aid at your fingertips, and you have to know what to do with it and how to do it. You can't just get on a sat phone and call England. So our training is very, very intense. If you get through the 4-day, and in those 4 days, you'll get about 6 hours of sleep, not consecutive. You'll end up going to what we call the 9-day. And at that point, we pay for your travel to England. And that's much more of an educational piece. Very, very important that you know everything about every item that's in that box, because you may come upon a UN gatekeeper that says, okay, what's that? Well, it's a thirst aid water filtration system. What does it weigh? Okay. What does a pallet weigh? What does it do? You have to have a school book knowledge of this kind of stuff. But when you do deploy, and back in the day, you used to get a phone call. I'm not sure how they always did it, but it would come in the middle of the night, and it's like roll over and tap my wife. honey, can I go to Guatemala? You know, well, now we work with deployment calendars. And when you have free time and you're available, you'll put yourself on that calendar. And then when it's time to deploy, you'll usually have 72 hours notice. You'll get a deployment briefing kit, you'll get your plane ticket, and then you go online, find out as much as you can. That's all paid for by donor dollars. You know, back when we used to sponsor boxes, we'd say it's $1,000 for the box. And everyone said, well, how much does that box really cost? Well, you know, all right, well, that box going here or that box going across the country? Because the cost of that response team, the cost to deliver that box, it's all included, you know, and things like that. But no, your airfare on the ground, that's all covered by ShelterBox. And then you're out in the field anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 weeks at that point. So no, we do that. And then again, it's very, very important. We talk about payment. I'll bring up another issue, that you understand what is normal to do business in that country. And that's where Rotary can come in, can be completely invaluable. You know, I always ask the question, you know that you've got people that are desperate, you have people that are dying, you have to get aid in hand, and you come to a roadblock, and it's customary to pay $10 to get through that roadblock. Well, do you pay the $10 or do you pay $20 to get through twice as fast? What would anybody answer? What do you do?
20 bucks.
Well, all right, makes sense, right? It's the absolute wrong answer, because what you've done is you've just doubled the cost of doing business in that country. Trust me, these people have cell phones. Everyone's going to know, oh, if they've got that ShelterBox, that Rotary logo, they'll pay. So you've now become a pariah in the disaster industry there. It's hugely important to know what's customary in that part of the country to do business, because you have to work within those norms. Mm-hmm. So I hope I answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, Larry.
Jim, I just wanted to let you know I sent you a chat with my contact information because I'm interested in helping out with the club. So if you just pick that up, and I'll be happy to do what I can.
Okay, okay. Hey, well, since you got me involved in the senior information fair parking thing, the least you can do is help with ShelterBox.
Well, we sure got out of that though, huh?
Oh, they keep calling, and they'll be back in business, and my club will be out there. So far, we haven't lost any Rotarians, nor have we lost any seniors, but we're keeping that moving.
It was a close call.
Okay, anyone else? All right.
All right, it's smaller. I gotta fill that out later.
I'm not sure if that's a question, but hey, thanks again, Jim. Send me your address, and we'll send you a speaker's gift. Our artist Alan Dunham draws up some beautiful cards, and we'll send them your way. So thanks again.
And I'm also going to I'll send some PDFs of these slides in case anybody has interest in those, and just some additional information for ShelterBox. If any questions come up after the fact, again, I'll give you my email address. Anyone can shoot me an email, and either through you or again, maybe I'll get an invite to come to speak in person to the club. Happy to do that. And if I could, I'd like to leave everybody with one thought in closing. And it's actually was from a speech given to the World Bank many, many years ago. And it has to do with, I think, the urgency of Rotary and ShelterBox. It says if we act now, if we think now and we act with effort, forethought, and courage, if we think globally and allocate our resources accordingly, we can give our children a more peaceful and equitable world, a world where suffering is greatly reduced and everybody can have a sense of hope. But I think the key is that's not a dream, my friends. That's a responsibility. And that's why I do what I do with ShelterBox, and that's why each and every one of you is a Rotarian, and that's why we gather. So thank you so much for what you do. God bless and good luck.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jim. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, Mike.
Over. Jim Spillman, can you announce the winning number?
The winning number is 2827, 2,827. Who's closest to that?
I had 2,800, Lynn Dawson.
Okay.
I have 2889, so you're closer than me, so yeah.
So anybody closer than 2,800? Lynn Dawson's the winner. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, next week's meeting is the Swan Song. and Chris's last meeting as president. And I think we may have a debunking video. We'll see. So that joins the meeting, and I'm going to try the bell.